Welcome to reading of the Maafa at FIT as we pay homage to those who came before us who were impacted by what the Swahili people refer to as the Maafa. The Maafa is a word that was coined, we believe quite appropriately so, to reflect the atrocities, to the horror, and most importantly, to the broader impact of a depopulating of the continent of Africa, the western and central parts of Africa in particular. We've come to normalize it by referring to it as the transatlantic slave trade without really understanding the way in which it destabilized the continent, gave rise to a diaspora, and gave rise to some of what we continue to see today in terms of a pattern of bias, discrimination that's rooted in the history of trafficking people from areas to other parts of the world. We're very grateful to Reverend Johnny Youngblood, a pastor out of New York City, St. Paul Community Baptist Church, who had the vision in 1995, after several years of contemplating how to give homage, how to recognize the atrocity of the so-called slave trade, that he developed really a movement that has spread across the US that honors the concept of Maafa. Maafa is the key Swahili word meaning the great catastrophe, and it is specific to what we refer to as the African Holocaust. Paul?
There were three junctures of the African slave trade: capture on the African continent, the Middle Passage, and plantation work. Between 10 to 15 million Africans were enslaved and forcefully transported across the Atlantic between 1500 and 1900. But this figure grossly underestimates the actual number of Africans enslaved, killed, or displaced as a result of this brutal slave trade. At least 2 million enslaved Africans, 10 to 15%, died during this infamous Middle Passage across the Atlantic. Another 15 to 30% died during the march to or confinement along the African coast. Altogether, for every 100 enslaved African who reached the New World, another 40 had died in Africa or during the Middle Passage. If enslaved Africans were thrown overboard at sea, the only legal problem that arose was whether or not the slave ship could claim compensation from the insurers. Around 40% of Africans uprooted in slavery are believed to have come from Angola in southern Africa, with another 30% from the Bay of Benin in West Africa. According to the estimates from researchers, if the slave trade had not occurred, then 72% of the average income gap between Africa and the rest of the world would not exist today. And 99% of the income gap between Africa and other developing countries would not exist. In other words, had the slave trade not occurred, Africa would have a similar level of development to Latin America or Asia. Western Europe and Africa had a relationship which ensured the transfer of wealth from Africa to Europe. According to Walter Rodney, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, over the past 4.5 centuries, Africa helped to develop Western Europe in the same proportion as Western Europe helped underdevelop Africa. The slave trade resulted in a growing capitalist money economy which meant an increase in the demand for gold coins and Europeans' anxiety to acquire gold in Africa. The impact of new markets opening up for the products, gold, ivory, hides, had complex results for the various chiefdoms in Africa. It drew competition, promoted war, and it encouraged slave raiding. Now, Eric Williams argued that a racial twist was given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, he said, racism was a consequence of slavery. Slavery ended because it was not economically viable due to the Industrial Revolution, and not so much the abolitionist movement of individuals such as William Wilberforce. According to Walter Rodney, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the simple fact is that no people can enslave another for 4 centuries without coming out with a notion of superiority. And when the color and other physical traits of those peoples were quite different, it was inevitable that the prejudice should take a racist form. What we see today in terms of the exposing of racism in Buckingham Palace, the struggle of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the recent removal of racist symbols and colonial statues across the United States is a confrontation of our racist colonial past. Only by facing our history and its hold on our psyche can we construct a better future. As a people, we must make sure that the social justice and racial reckoning taking place across the United States and across the globe do not bypass us. So
we begin the reading of the Maafa. And as is the tradition of most African peoples, we ask the permission of ancestors to begin that process. Paul.
Invocation, Omi Tutu, Ona Tutu, Tutu Lai, Tutu, Bobo Igon. We invoke the collective consciousness of the ancestors. We honor and acknowledge you today and always. We ask for your help and give you thanks. We ask for good health and we thank you. We ask that you help us with our inner transformation. When we don't know which road to follow, we ask that your wisdom will be our guide. May you protect us in all our daily travels and activities. Let us all live in harmony, peace, and unity. Alton?
Here is an overview of the slave trade out of Africa from 1500 to 1900. Enslaved Africans were taken by many routes from their homelands to other parts of the world. Estimates of the ocean-borne trade, which is the transatlantic movement, are more robust than are those for the Saharan, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf routes. It is thought that for the period from the end of the Roman Empire to 1900, about the same number of captives crossed the Atlantic as left Africa by all other routes combined. Here is the migration of sugar cultivation from Asia into the Atlantic. Sugar cultivation began in the Pacific in the pre-Christian era and gradually spread to the Eastern Mediterranean, the Gulf of Guinea, then to Brazil, before entering the Caribbean in the mid-17th century. 80% of all captives carried from Africa were taken to sugar-growing areas. Here are Old World slave trade routes in the Atlantic before 1759. Before the Atlantic slave trade began, and for 2 centuries thereafter, some African captives were taken to Europe as well as to the Atlantic islands and between African ports. It is hard to get precise estimates of these flows, but they were certainly much smaller than the transatlantic traffic. Many of the captives involved in this traffic were subsequently carried to sugar plantations in the Old World. Here are wind and ocean currents of the Atlantic basins. In the age of sail, winds and ocean currents shaped the direction of the transatlantic slave trade, effectively creating 2 separate slave trading systems. One in the north with voyages originating in Europe and North America, the other in the south with voyages originating in Brazil. Here are major regions and ports involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Few commercial centers in the Atlantic world were untouched by the slave trade, and all the major ports had strong connections with the traffic. Here are countries and regions in the Atlantic world where slave voyages were organized by share of captives carried off from Africa. Slave voyages were organized and left from all major Atlantic ports at some point over the nearly 4 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. Nevertheless, vessels from the largest 7 ports, Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, Liverpool, London, Nantes, Bristol, and Pernambuco, carried off almost 3/4 of all captives removed from Africa via the Atlantic Ocean. There was a major shift in the organization of slaving voyages, first from the Iberian Peninsula, which is comprised by Portugal, Spain, Gibraltar, and Andorra, and going to Northern Europe, and then later back again to ports in Southern Europe. A similar but less pronounced shift may be observed in the Americas from south to north and then back again. Here are major coastal regions from which captives left Africa throughout all the years. The limits of the regions shown here are Senegambia, anywhere north of the Rio Nunez. Sierra Leone region comprises the Rio Nunez to just short of Cape Mount. The windward coast is defined as Cape Mount southeast to and including the Assini River. The Gold Coast runs east of here up to and including the Volta River. Bight of Benin covers the Rio Volta to Rio Nun, and the Bight of Biafra east of the Nun and Cape Lopez inclusively. West Central Africa is defined as the rest of the western coast of the continent south of this point, and Southeastern Africa anywhere from and to the north and east of the Cape of Good Hope. West Central Africa was the largest regional departure point for captives through most of the slave trade era. Regions closer to the Americans and Europe generated a relatively small share of the total carried across the Atlantic. Voyage length was determined as much by wind and ocean currents as by relative proximity of ports of embarkation and disembarkation. Here are major regions where captives disembarked throughout all the years. The Caribbean and South America received 95% of the slaves arriving in the Americas. Some captives disembarked in Africa rather than the Americas because their transatlantic voyage was diverted as a result of a slave rebellion, or during the era of suppression because of capture by patrolling naval cruisers. Less than 4% disembarked in North America and only just over 10,000 in Europe. Here is volume and direction of the transatlantic slave trade from all African to all American regions. There were many different paths by which captives left Africa and reached the Americas. While there were strong connections between particular embarkation and disembarkation regions, it was also the case that captives from any of the major regions of Africa could disembark in almost any of the major regions of the Americas. Even captives leaving Southeast Africa, the region most remote from the Americas, could disembark in mainland North America as well as the Caribbean and South America. Lynn?
From 1501 to 1866, the transatlantic slave trade was responsible for the abduction and trafficking of men, women, and children. They were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. The numbers we will share with you represent those individuals who embarked and disembarked from the ships and the lives lost. We ask that you listen closely to the numbers and what each number represents. Patrice?
From Senegambia and offshore Atlantic, total of 753,361 men, women, and children embarked, 609,315 disembarked, 144,046 perished at sea. From Sierra Leone, a total of 371,330 embarked, 322,766 disembarked, 48,564 perished at sea. From the windward coast, a total of 333,620 embarked, 284,596 disembarked, 49,024 perished at sea. From the Gold Coast, a total of 1,206,605 embarked, 1,028,753 disembarked, 177,852 perished at sea.
From Bight of Benin, 1,947,231 embarked, 1,677,926 disembarked. Lives lost, 269,305. From the Bight of Biafra, 1,545,201 embarked, 1,277,824 disembarked. Lives lost, 267,377. From West Central Africa and St. Helena, 5,653,804 embarked, 4,918,975 disembarked. Lives lost, 734,829. From Southeast Africa and Indian Ocean Islands, 531,281 embarked, 426,937 disembarked. Lives lost, 104,344 lost their lives. In total, 12,342,433 embarked, 10,547,092 disembarked. Lives lost in total, 1,000,000 795,341. At this time, we ask that we take a moment of silence for the lives lost. Shanice?
It's established that as many as 15 million Africans were torn from their homeland and sold into slavery. The transfer of enslaved Africans to the Americas seems to imply America as the United States. In actuality, our African ancestors were brought from western coast of Africa, the enslaved coast, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Congo, and Angola.
Established trade routes to North America, South America, Europe, and the ports of interest and the industries they served. South Carolina, Charleston. Plantation laborers, cotton, sugar. Louisiana, New Orleans, cotton, rice, tobacco. Virginia, Richmond, tobacco, cotton. Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, El Salvador, Recife, plantation laborers. Peru, Lima, mining, sugar, tobacco. Argentina, Buenos Aires, mining. Chile, Valparaiso, mining. Colombia, Cartagena, mining and coffee. Suriname, Paramaribo, sugar. Portugal, Lisbon, cane sugar. United Kingdom, Bristol, London, Liverpool, cotton manufacturing. The Dutch, the Netherlands, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Curacao, cotton manufacturing. France, Bordeaux, cotton manufacturing.
In Havana, Cuba, plantation laborers were involved in mining and sugar. In Kingston, Jamaica, coffee. In the Dominican Republic, sugar. In Puerto Rico, San Juan, also sugar. And in Haiti, sugar. In Central America, Mexico City, Mexico, was mining, coffee, and sugar. Letitia?
Legacy, food of the enslaved, the impact of unhealthy eating habits on the Black community. Born into enslavement, Booker T. Washington once wrote that no much religion can exist in a one-room log cabin or an empty stomach. He said his family got their meals like dumb animals get theirs. It was a piece of bread here and a scrap of meat there, a cup of milk at one time and some potatoes at another. Sometimes a portion of our family would eat out of the skillet or pot, while someone else would eat from a tin plate held on the knees using nothing but hands to hold the food. The usual diet for slaves was cornbread and pork. Some form of meat was usually used in soups or stews by enslaved people. These one-pot meals would combine meat, vegetables, and broth, stretching out the meal proportions. This style of simmering meals over an open fire emulated West African cuisine, which relies heavily on stewed meals. Maize, rice, peanuts, yams, and dried beans were found as important staples of the enslaved on some plantations in West Africa before and after European contact. Keeping the traditional stew cooking could have been a form of subtle resistance to the owner's control. The potato hole or root cellar may also have been a sign of resistance to the slave owner. archaeologist Bill Kesso reported that these pits in Tidewater and Piedmont, Virginia, may have been a product of Black culture. According to a report on the state of obesity in 2017, approximately 48% of African Americans are obese compared to 33% of whites. What's equally startling is that 35% of African American children ages 2 to 19 are overweight. The adoption of enslaved influenced diets and the barriers we experience due to our physical environment have not only made African Americans the most obese racial group, but we are at a greater risk for chronic disease and illnesses. Enslaved food versus soul food. Quote unquote soul food originated during the enslavement period. Understanding our history, we know that enslaved people were fed scraps and leftovers discarded by their masters. The owners of the enslaved reserved the best nutritional foods for themselves. Enslaved people were given what was left of the animal remains once they picked through the food. As survivors, the enslaved people took what was given to them and made meals for their families. This style of cooking was birthed out of survival. Since then, we have passed these same dishes from generation to generation without realizing that this style of cooking could possibly be killing us slowly. Our bodies will work for us and sustain us until old age if we take care of them. Tor.
Legacy with regard to social relationships. It is quite striking that cultures normalize certain social behaviors. African Americans, people of African descent in other countries are known for what is often referred to as cool. In fact, cool is a social relationship that is a vestige of the enslavement period. The insistence upon masking one's emotions so that people in positions of power and authority over their lives would not be able to read their emotions. The legacy of child rearing. In many parts of the diaspora, child rearing practices can be quite severe. Vestiges of the enslavement period when people were routinely beaten and often brutalized, and often with instruments. Legacy with regard to marriage. So it is quite striking that at the end of the enslavement period in the United States, there was an urgent sense of reconstructing families, an urgent sense. It was common practice for the formerly enslaved to visit other plantations in search of individuals they may have married. Fast forward to the last 40 years, we are seeing a resurgence of single-parent homes. The concern, of course, being that the disruption during the enslavement period of relationships between husband and wife is being visited upon our communities again. Letitia?
Legacy. Post-traumatic slave syndrome and intergenerational trauma. Slavery is like a curse passing through the DNA of Black people, according to David Love. Many drama history movies reminds us of the physical toll that the enslavement period has taken on Black people. Enslavement was an exploitative system that built global capitalism through the theft, kidnapping, torture, and prison labor of millions of Africans. However, that process is and continues to be an intergenerational one in which Black people have suffered psychic damage. The experiences of the dreaded slave ship dungeons of the Middle Passage, in which millions of souls still rest at the bottom of the Atlantic, the auction blocks, the rapes, whippings, and lynchings, the slave patrols, the back-breaking and life-ending labor at gunpoint, the separation of families, all inflicted psychological damage on the victims and their descendants. Though their trauma was profound, enslaved people, Black people, had no mental health therapists available to them, no counselors to help them cope and heal. And the sickness was passed down to subsequent generations who, to this day, have not received the treatment they so desperately require. Black people have post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and may not even know it. Symptoms specific to race-based trauma in African Americans may include avoidance of white people, fears and anxiety in the presence of law enforcement, paranoia and suspicion, and excessive worries about the safety of family and friends. In a society in denial, racism is proclaimed dead and an historical phenomena, yet it is very much alive, as manifested in the behavior of many Black people. In the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing, Dr. Joy DeGroy discusses the condition that serves as the title of her book, Innocent and Angry Little Boys Threatened by a Glance, proud parents reluctant to praise their children and feeling the need to inhibit their natural exploratory instincts, friends not being able to celebrate the successes of their peers, organizations torn asunder from within, parents feeling the need to protect their children from the police, issues of skin color and hair texture continuing to dominate discussions regarding beauty and physical preference, the excessive focus on material accumulation, people needing, wanting, and dreaming, yet fearing they will not succeed. Most of all, frustration and anger, at times even rage, feelings that seem to be dominate many of our lives. If you're Black and living in America, none of this may be news to you. Dr. Farah Lubin responds to those who say that Black people should get over the trauma of slavery. It's a naive sentiment to say get over it, but they don't even know what they are getting over. There are symptoms and they don't even know why they are there. Tor?
In the midst of all of it, the legacy of mobilization for agency. The history of social justice movements, civil rights movements, are rooted in so-called slave revolts. The ability, even under the most oppressive of circumstances, to communicate and to insist upon justice, equality, and human dignity. Benita?
I will speak on the African contributions to the diaspora cultures. During the human bondage trade of our African ancestors that began in the 1500s, foods from Western Africa came to the Americas, including okra, pigeon peas, plantains, callaloo, cassava, sweet potatoes, yams, bananas, cornmeal, taro, breadfruit, and ackee. The methods of cooking can still be experienced in the diaspora as well. The cooking methods including frying, boiling, simmering, roasting, steaming foods wrapped in leaves, baking, and or a combination of 2 or 3 of these methods. Stews, breads, and dishes span tremendous distances, but are still prepared in the same fashion to this very day. For example, in Cuba, one of the most lasting influences is quimbombo, aka Cuban okra. Quimbombo is a traditional Cuban okra stew mixed with plantain, pork, shrimp, and other ingredients. The African Bantu tribe's word for okra is kigombo. Okra is a popular staple in North African cuisine. Historians believe that the seeds were brought over to the Americas by the Africans. This same dish can also be found in the United States as gumbo. In Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, tapado is a garifuna specialty. It's a coconut-based soup combined with seafood like conch, lobster, squid, shrimp, and crab. In Brazil, vatapa is a Bahian seafood stew made with coconut sauce. It's usually served with acaraje, which is made out of deep-fried beans. In Colombia, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Panama, and Venezuela, you'll find a dish called rondon, which comes from the word rundown, aka a meal made out of the foods that the cook was able to gather. And traditionally, it's also a seafood soup. In Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Mexico, you will find mangu, mofongo, and mogo mogo, all of which have origins in Western Africa after a dish called fufu, to dough made of yuca or cassava. In Jamaica, the national fruit is ackee, which is a plant that is native to Western Africa. Trinidad and Tobago, you'll find a common dish which is kalaloo, and is also has origins in Africa. In Haiti, you'll find ackee, taro root, plantain, as well as many stews and dishes with a direct connect to the African continent. These are just a few of the different countries and cultures whose palates were directly influenced by our African ancestors. In regards to music, Nelson Mandela said, "The curious beauty of African music is that it uplifts even as it tells a sad tale. You may be poor, you may have only a ramshackle house, you may have lost your job, but that song gives you hope." The following is a list of the many types of music influenced by our African roots. In American music, you'll find blues, disco, funk, hip hop, jazz, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, soul, spirituals, amongst many others. In Brazilian music, you'll find afoxé, capoeira, maracuto, samba, samba reggae, funk, carioca. In British black music, you'll find two-tone, afro swing, drum and bass, garage, hip hop, raga jungle. In Cape Verdean music, you'll find morna. In Colombian music, you'll find champeta. Cuban music, you'll find son. The music of the Dominican Republic includes bachata, merengue, and palo. The music of Ecuador includes bambuco, bomba. Garifuna music you'll find in Belize and in Honduras. Haitian music has been influenced through compa, contradance, merengue, rara, tubadu, rap creole. In Jamaica, you'll find music influenced by our African ancestors in dancehall, lovers rock, raga, reggae, rocksteady, and ska. In the Lesser Antilles, you'll find zouk music. In Barbados, you'll find sponge. In Trinidad and Tobago, you'll find calypso. In Peru, you'll find landó, festejo, and cueca. In Puerto Rico, you'll find bomba, plena, reggaeton. In Uruguay and Argentina, you'll find candombe. Another influence that you'll find is in religion. Afro-American religions involve ancestor worship and include a creator deity along with a pantheon of divine spirits such as the Orisha, Loa, Vodun, Nkisi, Alusi, among others. In addition to the religious syncretism of these various African traditions, many also incorporate elements of folk Catholicism, including folk saints and other forms of folk religion, Native American religion, spiritism, spiritualism, shamanism, and European folklore. The following are some of these religions in the diaspora. In Brazil, you'll find Batuque and Candomblé, Catimbo, Macumba, Quimbanda, Santo Daime, Tambor de Mina, Ubanda. In Cuba, you'll find Abacua, a Rara religion, Cuban Voodoo, Palo, and Santeria. In Curacao, you'll find Montamentu. In Dominican Republic, you'll find Dominican Voodoo, 21 División. In Guyana, you'll find Comfa. In Haiti, you'll find Haitian Voodoo. In Jamaica, you'll find Convince, Cromanti dance under Jamaican Maroon religion. Cumina, Mial, Obia. In Puerto Rico, you'll find Sanse Espiritismo. In St. Lucia, you'll find Kele. In Suriname, you'll find Winti. Trinidad and Tobago, Spiritual Baptist, and Trinidad Orisha. In the United States, you'll find Hoodoo, also known as Gula Voodoo or Low Country Voodoo, as well as Louisiana Voodoo. There are so many other ways the diaspora has been influenced by our African ancestors, from our hair, clothes, art, mannerisms, and traditions. Thank you for allowing us to share a little bit about foods, music, and religion. Before I go, I'd like to share a connection within my own traditions that I found links right back to Western Africa. This is how I was taught to sweep by my elders. We were taught to sweep in the morning, from the four corners into the middle of the room and out of the door. Many years later, I found this is common practice in Western Africa. Thank you for listening, and I hope you were able to learn something new. Hopefully, this presentation will help you find your own connections to Africa.
Legacy. Inventions. The Ironing Board in 1892 by Sarah Boone. Cash registers in 1890 by B.F. Jackson. The Shoe Lasting Machine, 1883 by Jan Matzelinger. The Elevator, 1867, Alexander Miles. A Cotton Chopper, 1894, G.W. Murray. The Refrigerator, 1891, John Standard. Biscuit Cutter, 1875, Alexander Ashbourne. The Printing Press, 1878, W.A. Lalevette. The Pencil Sharpener, 1897, J.L. Love. Fire Escape Ladder, 1879, Joseph Winters. Deadly
Ndabezitha, siyabonga, kuyalebuha. We want to thank you all for your participation in this incredibly important educational event. As we reflect on the suffering of those that lost their ties to the continent, let us not forget the suffering of those who remained. Let us allow Ubuntu, the common humanity that connects the whole diaspora, to fill our hearts with a renewed spirit and keep us marching, no longer separated, towards excellence. TARDIS.
Understanding the past provides significant insight into the future. Let the incredible challenges of our ancestors who were forced to journey on land and the sea provide fuel for us to see and land our feet in ways that uplift and empower all of us to achieve our goals. The program you have just participated in is a testament to the incredible power of the human spirit. Through many trials, countless abuses, and marginalization, our people have demonstrated the power to create, the ability to love, and the ambition to grow. Let those lessons resonate within you on a daily basis. It is also important to value the lived space and experiences of our fellow human beings. Through understanding, listening, observation, and engagement, we can learn that while our own feet may be tired, through companionship and engagement, the journey of life does not necessarily have to be one embedded with strife or walked alone. We all bleed red. We all breathe the same air. Let us embrace one another in a spirit of agape. Thank you.